Lecture 7.2, Property Rights, the Environment, and Poverty. We ended Lecture 7.1 with an example of marginal analysis, and we'll start here by going back to the list of economic reasoning tools and what we studied in Lessons 3, 4, 5, and 6. So, a little quiz here. What institutional arrangement directs resources to their most highly valued uses? Right, markets. Oh yeah, you say. So you really think so? How's that market allocation thing working out for us? We have pollution and disappearing rainforests and endangered species and stinking trash dumps. And you'd have a point that has spurred economists to ask, I wonder what's going on here. If it's true that markets allocate resources to their most highly valued uses, and we all say we value the environment, why don't we have the high level of environmental quality that we want? The first economist to make headway in solving the general problem of why we sometimes don't use our resources to produce the things we value most was the British economist A.C. Pigou. His research led him to conclude that it happens because there are some circumstances under which markets simply will not work. He dubbed this market failure. He explained the problem by noting that when markets work well, the costs and benefits are captured in the exchange. But, he said, there are instances when that doesn't happen, and some of the costs or benefits escape and spill over onto other people, and the market fails. It works like this. Suppose that you drive into Frank's fine, friendly filling station, hand Frank a $50 bill, and Frank fills up your car with fine mid-grade fuel. Each of you bore a cost and received a benefit that was captured or internal to that exchange. Your cost was whatever else you would have bought with the money you gave Frank, and your benefit was the gasoline that allows you to drive wherever you want to. And here's the magic of markets part. Notice how your cost, the money you paid Frank, became Frank's benefit, and his cost, the gasoline he could have sold to someone else or used himself, became your benefit. You and Frank exchanged benefits and costs. They were internal to the transaction. Perfect. Everyone's happy. You pocket your change and drive away singing along to the radio, and Frank grins as he drops the bill in the cash drawer. Now, if that was the whole story, then the market would have worked like the model predicts. There would have been just the right amount of gasoline produced, and our resources would have been used in their most highly valued ways. But Pigou realized that that's not the end of the story, because as you drive away in that rattle-trap driving machine that you bought with your oh-so-generous teacher's salary, you're spewing out another cost from the tailpipe, and you didn't pay for that cost. You're using the resource of air to dispose of the waste you produce by purchasing gasoline and driving. And everyone in the general vicinity who happens to be breathing bears that cost. The gasoline and the money were internal to the exchange, but the pollution is external, a cost that spills over onto people who weren't involved in the exchange at all. This type of spillover cost is what A.C. Pigou identified as the cause of market failure, and he labeled these externalities. Spillover costs like pollution are called negative externalities, and spillover benefits are called positive externalities. The classic example of a positive externality is a beautiful garden. Your neighbor's garden is spectacular. They bear the cost, willingly providing the effort and paying the expense to create a stunning yard. And then, everyone on the block and people walking or driving by get to enjoy it without contributing 1 penny to the costs. The neighbors have provided all of you a positive externality. Another example of a positive externality, not nearly so enjoyable as a garden, is getting a flu shot. Yes, really. Because if you bear the cost in money and pain, the community benefits from the reduced likelihood that you'll get the flu and pass it along to someone else. Positive externalities like that sometimes become the rationale for requiring people to pay for a good or service through taxation. But We'll get to that in Lesson 8. For now, what you need to remember is that Pigou said that when markets fail to provide the right amount of a good or service, that is, the amount that allocates resources to their most highly valued uses, it's because there are externalities. He helped us to see that as long as there are external costs or benefits, the market isn't going to operate as our model predicts. It'll produce too much pollution and too few gardens instead of just the right quantity that society wants. Ideally, if we could find a way to bring those costs and benefits back into the exchange, to internalize them, then we wouldn't have a problem. But that's not an easy thing to do. How do we make people pay costs they unwittingly impose on others or benefits they enjoy at others' expense? Pigou's suggestion was that when the market fails, government should step in to correct the problem through taxation or regulation. And through most of the second half of the 20th century, that was the dominant approach we used to solve problems like pollution. In the latter decades, however, we began to explore methods other than government intervention, things like cooperation, negotiation, and, most exciting for economists, finding accommodations that would make it possible for markets to function the way they're supposed to. This is where property rights comes back into our discussion. You thought we were never going to get there, didn't you? But enter another British economist, Ronald Coase. Coase wasn't satisfied with the explanation that the market failed to capture the cost and benefits. He asked why it didn't. He wanted to figure out what it was about the rules of the game that explained why externalities appeared in the first place. The short answer, he found, is that externalities exist when property rights aren't clearly defined or can't be enforced. Coase pointed out that one of the rules of the game in markets is that you have to own whatever it is you bring into the market to exchange. In the case of air pollution from car exhaust, the market doesn't deal with the problem because we don't know who owns the air. The air is a commons that we all use pretty much as we wish, including not just to breathe, but also as a place to dispose of exhaust from our cars, smoke from our fireplaces, and gas from our factories. And we know what happens to a commons, right? It gets overused and the resource degrades. Coase's insight helped us turn our focus to how we might enable markets through property rights rather than supplanting them with government. Because, as he pointed out, there's also such a thing as government failure. Government didn't seem to be having a great deal of success attacking problems like pollution. Again, why government institutions face this problem we'll get into in the next lesson. For now, in simplest terms, what Coase said is that if you can clearly assign and enforce the property rights, the market will work just fine, thank you very much, and that helping to define and assign the property rights is the more appropriate role for government than stepping in to try to regulate or correct the market. Here's an example we use with students in the Economics for Leaders summer programs. The professor enters the classroom one day, happily chomping on his breakfast or lunch, and haphazardly throws orange peels, peanut shells, and other trash on the floor, or even on students' desks as he begins his lecture. Before long, he's trashed the room. He's obviously enjoying the benefits of purchasing his breakfast and using the room to dispose of what he doesn't want, but he's imposed a cost on the students who are now sitting in a polluted room. Usually, it doesn't take long before the students complain and want him to clean up the mess. And the professor nonchalantly replies that it doesn't bother him and tells them to just ignore it. When, of course, they don't ignore it, he impatiently informs them to get over it, pay attention to the lecture. After all, it's his room, and he shows them the schedule with his name, the time, and the room number. Now, you can see how this progresses, because, of course, the students will say it's their room, too. Their schedules have the same room number and time on them. If we try to solve the problem with a Pigouvian response, we would turn to government. The students would complain to the administration to regulate the prof's behavior or impose a fine when he trashes the room. Now, fines could work, but we'd have to find the right level of fine to keep him from polluting. What if he pays the fine and goes right on polluting? Are we okay with that? Probably not, since that's not the outcome we wanted. And we'd have to pay the costs of monitoring his behavior and collecting the fines. If we go with Coase's thinking, the students would turn to the administrator, the government, but only to clarify the property rights. Right now, it's not clear who owns the room, just as it's not clear who owns the air that you pollute when you drive your car. So the prof and the students are going to have a hard time resolving their dispute amicably. But answering the question, whose room is it, opens up all sorts of options. Suppose that it is somehow clarified that the property rights to the room are assigned to the teacher. He may trash the room all day, every day, as long as he cleans it up at the end of the year. But the students still don't like the mess. How could they get the room cleaned up or avoid having it messed up again in the future? One possibility is that a student might go get a trash can and place it right next to the prof so that it's easier for him to use. Think of this as a student voluntarily taking on some of the cost in the hopes of reducing the cost of cleanliness to the prof. The students could plead. They could make a moral case and change the polluter's perception of the costs and benefits of throwing around his breakfast trash. Now, I want to step aside for a minute here. Although this isn't where we want to end up in looking at Coase, don't underestimate the power of moral suasion in changing people's perceptions of costs and benefits at the margin. It can be an effective tool. Consider the success of the environmental movement, starting with First Lady Johnson and her campaign to beautify America, or the Earth Day activities that started in about 1970. The environmental movement has definitely changed people's perception of the cost of things like throwing trash out of car windows or on the ground. But anyway, back to Coase. The final option that he opens up to us is using the market, making an exchange in order to get the level of environmental quality we want. Since the prof has the property rights and doesn't want to assume the costs of keeping the room clean each day, what if the students changed the benefits for him? Instead of picking up or living with his trash, they could pay him not to litter, which would increase his benefits of using the trash can. Aha! Now he has to think about how much he values his right to throw stuff on the floor, and they have to think about how much they're willing to pay to get him to stop. Those, then, are the options that opened up to us once we assigned the rights to the professor. Interestingly, however, what Coase pointed out is that it doesn't matter who owns the property rights as long as they're clearly defined. If we gave the property rights to the students, we'd end up with the same kinds of solutions to finding an acceptable level of trash. If the rights belong to the students and Professor Trash really doesn't want to be bothered to use the trash can, he could offer to pay the students to let him throw it on their desks. Now, they have to decide, is the payment he's offering enough to make it worth putting up with the trash or cleaning it up themselves? The point is that when property rights are clearly defined, we can eliminate the externalities regardless of who holds the property rights. Ownership of property by one party and an offer by someone else to use that property in a different way makes the owner place a value on it. And once that's done, offers and exchanges can be made. The process of defining property rights so that willing buyer, willing seller transactions can take place has opened up all sorts of innovative endeavors for dealing with environmental problems and providing the environmental amenities that 20th and 21st century societies value. As promised, we'll wrap up this lecture by commenting on the importance of property rights to economic growth. You may remember this slide from the last lecture, where we noted the correlation between the institutions that promote economic growth and the GDP per capita, or standard of living, of nations of the world. One of the institutions that was measured in making the Fraser map is the strength of property rights. The slide on the screen now is more evidence affirming the relationship between institutions and standard of living. This graph from the International Property Rights Institute's 2010 report ranking the countries of the world in terms of the strength of their property rights institutions. The countries here are grouped into quintiles, with the top quintile comprising the countries with the strongest property rights, and the bottom quintile the countries in which property rights are weakest or non-existent. Even when we isolate this one growth-promoting institution, the correlation to people's well-being is undeniable. As IRPI comments, quote, over a 2007-2010 average, countries in the top quintile of property rights rankings enjoy a per capita income 8 times that of their counterparts in the bottom quintile. Now, we mentioned earlier that property rights that aren't enforceable aren't property rights at all. So the rule of law is an essential companion to and component of wealth-producing property rights. This slide shows the World Justice Project's summary of the strength of the rule of law by region. Lower numbers on the chart mean higher rankings or stronger institutions, and higher numbers indicate lower rankings and weaker institutions. And you remember the map. Again, the correlation between institutional strength and standard of living is clear. Having established that connection, we have to ask why and how property rights and the rule of law make such a difference in the wealth and poverty of nations. Part of the answer goes back to our previous lesson on entrepreneurship and risk. The risks of business and the strength of the profit motive are in part a function of the strength or weakness of property rights and the rule of law. As people consider the costs and benefits of entrepreneurial ventures, two things that weigh heavily on the cost side are the uncertainty of legal claims to protection of property and, somewhat paradoxically, the inability to assume debt. Now, you probably don't think of going into debt as a good thing, but reconsider. For most of us, it was an invaluable tool to making the investments that have led us to more comfortable standards of living. Cars, college educations, and houses, not to mention business ventures, are among the common investments people in developed countries make in their own wealth and well-being. Debt is an avenue of improvement that's closed off to most of the world's poor because they don't have property rights that can be collateral for loans. They have property, but they own it extra-legally without defensible property rights. Hernando de Soto, economist and author of The Mystery of Capital, calls the informally owned or extra-legal property of the poor dead capital, because the owners can't leverage its value to invest in their future productivity. His estimates of the amount of dead capital held by impoverished people in developing countries runs in the trillions of dollars. In the FTE curriculum unit and online class, Is Capitalism Good for the Poor?, we investigate in depth the role of legal title and enforceable property rights in improving the lives of the poor, and you're encouraged to look at those materials or take that course if you'd like to dig deeper into the topic. For our purposes here, it's enough to just emphasize that the evidence is clear. Property isn't just wealth itself. It's also a tool for the creation of more wealth. The importance of the connection between property rights and the rule of law is also seen in the procedural and transaction costs of conducting business in poor countries. De Soto's Institute for Liberty and Democracy in Peru describes the burden of these costs in everyday terms. Imagine a country where nobody can identify who owns what. Addresses cannot be easily verified. People cannot be made to pay their debts. Resources cannot be conveniently turned into money. Ownership cannot be divided into shares. Descriptions of assets are not standardized and cannot be easily compared. And the rules that govern property vary from neighborhood to neighborhood or even from street to street. You have just put yourself into the life of a developing country. More precisely, you've imagined life for 80% of its population. All right, moving on. We find that there's also a connection between property rights-based innovations to help us produce environmental amenities and preserve or enhance environmental quality, and the problem of poverty in the developing world. Because many environmental issues involve resources that people in developing countries use to generate their income, but that people in developed countries regard as environmental amenities to be preserved. Think of herds of free-roaming elephants that are treasured by wildlife advocates in the West, but are seen as enormous gray rats to the African farmers whose crops and huts they trample. Brazilian loggers see lucrative hardwoods, where Western environmentalists see species habitat and priceless wilderness. So if we think about some parallels to the scenario of Professor Trash and the students who want the clean classroom, we can understand or look at some of the innovations policymakers are generating to create win-win solutions that start by identifying the property rights. For example, innovative programs have given property rights to elephants and to elephant hunting to the local African villagers. If they protect the herd and the herd grows, the villagers can sell the very valuable big game licenses to Western hunters. The transferable right to hunt the elephants has resulted in more elephants, less poaching of this endangered species, and importantly, increased income and improved quality of life for the villagers, who are now invested in preserving and enhancing the value of their elephant property. Innovative ecoterrorism programs in Latin American jungles have turned loggers and hunters into tour guides. Holding a valuable property right, the tour guide license, provides incentives for indigenous people to jealously husband the resources that used to benefit them only when they were cut down or killed. As we conclude this lecture, then, here are the big ideas to take away. First, property rights are human rights. They're the rights of individuals to themselves and their possessions. Private property rights create incentives for wise use and conservation of resources and possessions. Common or collective property rights, on the other hand, create incentives that lead to dissipation and degradation of those resources. As we apply our general understanding of property rights institutions and incentives to specific issues like the environment or world poverty, we should also remember that one of the most important tasks of government is to define and protect property rights so that our economic institutions can do the work they're designed to do. Next, markets allocate resources to their most highly valued uses, including environmental uses, only when the conditions for effective markets are present. And one of those conditions is that the parties to an exchange have to own what they're trading. Remember, the environment is an economic good, and both environmental quality and the lives of the poor are in part a function of how well government defines and defends property rights.